The old cemetery, it was a crisp autumn evening when the town of Blackwood began to close its doors against the chill. The small, tight-knit community had lived with the presence of the old cemetery on the outskirts for generations, yet few dared to venture there after dark. Situated on a hill overlooking a murky pond, the cemetery had been the final resting place for the town's dead for over 2 centuries. The graves were old, their headstones weathered and covered in moss, many of the names long faded into obscurity. For as long as anyone could remember, there had been stories about the cemetery, stories of strange lights, eerie sounds, and ghostly apparitions. The pond, in particular, was said to be haunted. Some claimed that on still nights, the water's surface would shimmer with an unnatural glow, and the air would be filled with the faint sound of whispers. Despite these tales, the cemetery had always been a place of solace for those mourning their loved ones, a quiet spot where the living could commune with the dead. Emma Turner had never been one to believe in ghost stories. A practical young woman of 19, she preferred to focus on her studies and her future rather than entertain the superstitions that fascinated her peers. But on that particular autumn evening, she found herself in a situation she couldn't easily dismiss. It was during a gathering at her friend Lucy's house that the conversation turned to the old cemetery. The small group of friends, seated around a crackling fire, exchanged tales they had heard over the years of the restless spirits that wandered the graves and the eerie lights that flickered near the pond. It was then that Lucy, always the instigator, suggested a dare, a midnight visit to the cemetery. "I'll bet you won't stay there for more than 5 minutes," Lucy challenged, her eyes sparkling with mischief. Emma hesitated. She wasn't afraid of the dark, nor did she believe in ghosts, but the thought of venturing into the cemetery alone was unsettling. However, not wanting to appear cowardly in front of her friends, she reluctantly agreed. "Fine," Emma said, trying to sound braver than she felt. "I'll do it. But when I come back and nothing happens, you all have to admit that the stories are just nonsense." Just before midnight, Emma set out alone toward the cemetery, armed only with a flashlight. The night was cold, and the moon hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the town. As she walked, the crunch of leaves underfoot was the only sound in the stillness. The closer she got to the cemetery, the heavier the air seemed to become, as if the very atmosphere was thickening with the weight of the past. When she reached the wrought iron gate that marked the entrance, Emma paused, staring at the shadowy expanse beyond. The trees that lined the path to the pond loomed like silent sentinels, their branches bare and skeletal. Swallowing her apprehension, she pushed the gate open with a creak and stepped inside. The cemetery was even more imposing in the dark. The headstones jutted out of the earth like jagged teeth, and the paths between the graves were barely discernible under the fallen leaves. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying foliage, a smell that seemed to cling to Emma's clothes as she walked. She made her way down the winding path, the beam of her flashlight flickering across the ancient gravestones. Names and dates from centuries past seemed to watch her as she passed, their histories lost to time. As she approached the pond, the silence grew more pronounced, as if the very earth had hushed itself in anticipation. Emma arrived at the pond's edge, where the water lay still and black as ink. Moonlight reflected faintly off its surface, but there was no sign of the mysterious glow she had heard about. She exhaled slowly, her breath visible in the cold air, and looked around. "Nothing but a bunch of old stories," she muttered to herself, feeling a mix of relief and disappointment. But just as she was about to turn back, she heard it, a faint whisper, carried on the wind. Emma froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She strained to listen, but the whisper was gone as quickly as it had come. She shook her head, telling herself it was just the wind playing tricks on her. Then she saw it, a figure standing on the opposite side of the pond, barely visible in the darkness. At first, Emma thought it might be one of her friends playing a prank, but as she looked closer, she realized that the figure wasn't moving. It stood there, motionless, its features obscured by the shadows. Emma's breath caught in her throat. She raised her flashlight and pointed it toward the figure, but the beam seemed to falter, barely illuminating the space in front of her. She tried to call out, but her voice died in her throat. The figure remained still, watching her with an intensity that sent a chill down her spine. Summoning her courage, Emma took a step forward. As she did, the figure began to move, gliding silently around the edge of the pond toward her. It was then that Emma saw its face, or rather, the lack of it. The figure's features were indistinct, as if shrouded in mist, but its eyes were clearly visible, two dark, hollow voids that seemed to suck in the very light around them. Panic surged through Emma, and she stumbled back, her mind screaming at her to run. But her legs felt like lead, rooted to the spot as the figure drew closer. The whispers returned, louder this time, swirling around her in a cacophony of unintelligible voices. "Go away!" Emma finally managed to scream, turning on her heel and fleeing back toward the cemetery gate. Her flashlight flickered wildly as she ran, casting erratic shadows that seemed to dance in her periphery. The whispers followed her, growing louder and more frantic with each step. By the time she reached the gate, Emma was gasping for breath, her heart hammering in her chest. She threw herself against the iron bars, forcing them open with a strength she didn't know she had, and sprinted back toward town. It wasn't until she reached the safety of the well-lit streets that she dared to look back. The cemetery loomed behind her, dark and silent once more. The whispers were gone, and the figure had vanished into the night. But the terror that gripped Emma refused to loosen its hold. She knew what she had seen was no trick of the light, no figment of her imagination. Emma's friends were waiting for her at Lucy's house when she returned, pale and trembling. They crowded around her, eager to hear what had happened, but the words stuck in her throat. All she could manage was a shaken, "I saw something. Something wasn't right." Her friends laughed it off at first, thinking she was trying to keep up the ruse of the dare. But when they saw the fear in her eyes, their amusement faded. They tried to comfort her, insisting it must have been a shadow or a trick of the moonlight, but Emma couldn't shake the image of those hollow eyes watching her. Over the next few days, Emma tried to put the experience behind her, but the nightmares began almost immediately. Each night, she found herself back at the pond, the whispers growing louder until they drowned out her thoughts. The figure would always appear, gliding toward her with those empty, staring eyes, until she woke up drenched in sweat, her screams echoing in the silence of her room. It wasn't long before the haunting began to bleed into her waking hours. She would catch glimpses of the figure in mirrors, in windows, and in the corners of dark rooms. The whispers followed her wherever she went, a constant, maddening presence that gnawed at her sanity. Desperate for answers, Emma began to research the history of the cemetery. She spent hours in the town's library, poring over old records and newspaper clippings, hoping to find some explanation for what she had seen. It was there that she stumbled upon an old journal, buried in the archives, written by a man named Samuel Reed in the late 1800s. Samuel had been a caretaker at the cemetery, and his journal chronicled a series of strange occurrences he had witnessed during his time there. He wrote of seeing a figure by the pond, a ghostly apparition that matched Emma's description exactly. According to Samuel, the figure was the spirit of a woman who had drowned in the pond many years before, her soul trapped between worlds, unable to find peace. Samuel's final entry was the most chilling. The whispers grow louder each night. "I fear she will not rest until another takes her place." Emma knew what she had to do. If she was going to free herself from the haunting, she would have to return to the cemetery and confront the spirit. She didn't tell anyone of her plan, not wanting to involve her friends in the danger that lay ahead. On the night of the full moon, Emma made her way back to the cemetery, her heart pounding with fear and determination. She carried with her a small vial of salt and a sprig of rosemary, old folk remedies for warding off spirits, given to her by an elderly woman in town who had heard of her plight.